Hey guys, tonight we unravel one of the strangest, darkest, and most disturbing deaths ever recorded in European history. The death of George II of Bavaria, the Duke, whose lifetime of absolute power could not save him from an ending so grotesque that monks vomited while writing about it, and that later generations would remember him by one single title, the Duke with the most bizarre death. This is the story of a ruler who once burned villages in fits of rage, who ordered women to be beheaded right in the middle of a feast, yet in the end could not escape the prison of his own body. A body that swelled, rotted, split open like a decaying barrel, and eventually burst on a scorching summer day, sending the entire castle fleeing in terror. Not a war, not an assassination plot, not a legend embroidered by storytellers, but a real death full of blood, pus, the stench of decay, and final moments so horrifying that monks wrote in their chronicles with trembling hands, "We have never seen a man decompose while still alive." And tonight we will trace each step, each final breath, each scream echoing through stone walls, to understand why his death became one of Europe's greatest nightmares. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As we prepare to enter this chilling journey, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below. I'd love to know which corner of the planet you're joining this story from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stench did not arrive on the final day of his life. It came much earlier, seeping through stone walls, clinging to the cloaks of the guards, drifting in the damp and shadowed corridors. The monks wrote that wherever George II stepped, the candles seemed to lose their breath, and the servants swallowed hard as though the air itself had turned into poison. His swollen belly, stretched like an overfilled wine barrel, was seen as a warning from death, a warning no one dared to name. But to understand that smell, that heavy omen quietly announcing the tragedy to come, one must look back at the man who created it, George II of Bavaria. A name once whispered across the region, a shadow that hovered over vast lands, and a soul that began rotting long before his life ever touched the final darkness. George II was born into a ducal family, carrying the bloodline of those who had ruled with iron hands for many generations. His grandfather had been a stern, proud man, who believed Bavaria was the cornerstone of the entire southern German world. His father, a harsh man living by rigid principles, taught him that strength mattered more than mercy, and fear was the language common people understood best. His mother, the complete opposite, was gentle, refined, noble by birth yet fragile in health, and she died when he had barely learned how to form letters. The only softness in his life vanished that early. He had several siblings, but none were truly close. Royal children often grow the way distant stars grow, sharing the same sky but never touching each other. From childhood, George II became accustomed to being the center, the heir, the one who would rule everything. Perhaps that was why loneliness wrapped around him long before he learned to feel it. His education was considered solid for the era. He could read Latin, understand the law, negotiate, and excel in horseback riding and archery. But he lacked the one trait a ruler needed most: patience. Tutors recalled that he learned quickly, but angered just as quickly, understood swiftly, but grew bored even faster. He preferred war tales over philosophy, the clashing of steel over the quiet counsel of the scriptures. Still, not everything in him was darkness. People admitted that the young George II possessed strength, vitality, and a certain natural authority. He once helped several families after a failed harvest. He personally funded the rebuilding of an old chapel, and for a short time he even entertained the desire to become the most beloved duke. But those sparks of goodness never lasted. They went out like candles snuffed by a gust of cold wind along a dark corridor. As an adult, he married a noble woman of good lineage, well-educated and gentle by nature. She was not dazzlingly beautiful, but serene and reserved. They had several children, little ones who carried their father's pride and their mother's kindness. Yet family was never strong enough to anchor him. His temper was too sharp, his impulses too fierce, and with each passing year he grew more volatile, more unpredictable, more feared. His virtues, if counted, were strength, decisiveness, and a commanding presence. His flaws, however, were as many as the moss growing on the castle stones. Authoritarian by instinct, quick to anger, hungry for control, and obsessed with power, to the point he left no room for anything else. He believed a duke did not need to be loved, only feared, did not need to listen, only command, did not need to explain, only punish. And then, within the mix of power, pride, isolation, illness, and unwise choices, his body began to betray him early. The stench was the first reminder, a reminder no one dared to utter, yet one everyone felt in the breath they tried to hold whenever they crossed his path. He did not die by the sword, nor by a hidden enemy. He died because of his own body, because his intestines burst in the suffocating heat of summer, when the castle stones burned like coals. But to understand that death, one must return to the time when he stood at the height of his power, when his voice was strong enough to erase an entire village in a single afternoon, when his gaze was sharp enough to make an entire court tremble. George II of Bavaria, a ruler who treated every life as dust in his hand. Chronicles record that he burned villages that dared to resist, ordered the hands of thieves cut off as warnings, and even taxed monasteries, places meant to be sacred, safe. People called him the Master of Fear. The entire duchy lived under his shadow, a long, foul-smelling shadow that grew wider each year. But those chronicles, though written in ink, carry the faint smell of an unspoken truth. That behind the bloody victories, behind the brutality, was a body decaying day by day, a silent curse eating him from within, something no sword or throne could ever withstand. This is the beginning of that tale, a tale that cannot be read quickly, a tale meant to be breathed slowly, so slowly for every detail is an echo of a corpse rotting while still alive. George II did not rule through decrees alone. He ruled through terror. Chronicles record that once, in the midst of a lavish feast, he ordered the beheading of 3 young women for the crime of laughing at the castle gate. Guests chewed roasted boar, while the executioner swung his blade before their eyes. The sound of flesh being cleaved mixed with the gentle clinking of wine cups that was his court, a place where joy and cruelty sat at the same table without shame. And then women became the Duke's second blood-soaked pastime. He sent his men to scour fairs and villages, dragging back the most beautiful girls as though he were gathering livestock. Anyone who refused him was considered guilty of insulting the throne. There was a young woman named Martha, bold enough to turn her face away when he tried to touch her waist in front of a crowd. By the next morning, she was found dead outside the castle walls. No one asked who had given the order. No one dared. He chose his mistresses the way merchants chose goods. Sitting in a great chair, he watched each girl walk past, nodding at the ones he desired and waving away those he did not. Sometimes, deep in the night, he demanded that all be awakened to dance for his amusement. If the music was too soft, he shouted. If their steps were too slow, he struck them. No one knew when he would laugh, when he would rage, or when he would demand blood. The uncertainty itself became a kind of torture, a silent edge, sharper than any blade. But as the court trembled, his body once strong, once described as like a warrior who devours meat raw, began to shift, slowly, quietly, as though death were walking down the corridors of the castle long before anyone noticed its passing shadow. He gained weight. His breath grew short. His face flushed endlessly from wine and meat. Yet power made everything seem normal. He could scream, feast, command, and punish exactly as before, and so no one dared to speak the truth aloud. His body had begun to betray him. At first, the change was nothing more than a heaviness in his steps, a stiffness when he rose from the banquet table. His servants whispered that his gait seemed slower, as if each movement cost him just a bit more breath, a bit more pain. But whispers die quickly in a court ruled by fear. No one allowed themselves to notice what was happening, because noticing meant acknowledging danger not for him, but for themselves. The swelling came next. His legs thickened until they strained against his boots. The Duke, proud of his strength, ignored it. But the servants saw. They watched him sit longer, climb stairs less often, linger in his chair with a hand pressed against his side. He dismissed the discomfort with wine, laughter, and rage. The truth, however, sat on his body like an invisible weight, growing heavier every night. Those close to him claimed that the smell was the first true warning. Faint at first, like something spoiled behind a closed door. Then thicker, stronger, clinging to fabric, lingering in the halls long after he had passed. The monks wrote that the stench seemed to rise from his skin, as though rot had begun its work before the flesh had even broken. A scent that was not yet death, but unmistakably its herald. Still, no one spoke. A duke could not be questioned, especially not one so violent, so quick to choke the air from a room with nothing but a glance. And so the court played along, eating, drinking, smiling, bowing, while pretending not to smell the warning drifting from his body like a curse beginning to breathe. His temper worsened with his discomfort. The smallest mistake led to punishment, a delayed greeting, a tremble in a servant's hand, a musician who played a note too high. His rages grew more unpredictable, more venomous. Those who served him described feeling as if they lived inside a storm with no sky, no horizon, only thunder waiting to strike somewhere, at someone, without reason. Yet beneath all that fury lived a single truth no one dared whisper. His strength was fading, slowly, like a candle melting itself away, and as his body weakened, his need to dominate hardened. He demanded more obedience, more entertainment, more violence, as though forcing the world to kneel might somehow silence the pain blooming inside him. But pain does not kneel. It grows. And so his flesh began the long process of closing around him, tightening like the walls of a dungeon. The swelling, the breathlessness, the rising heat in his limbs. These were the first faint bars of the prison waiting to claim him. A prison made not of stone or iron, but of his own decaying body. A prison with no door. A prison no power could break. A prison from which he would never escape. The illness did not arrive suddenly. It crept toward him like a patient beast. First came the strained steps on the staircase, each one heavier than the last. Then, the evenings, when he sat longer, breathing harder, as though even the air resisted entering his lungs, until one day his legs swelled so monstrously that the servants could no longer remove his boots. They had to cut them open with knives, because the leather had fused to his skin, like the hardened shell of a wound that no longer healed. Gout, the sentence reserved for those who drowned themselves in wine and meat, tore his body apart piece by piece. The attacks struck without warning, sudden as lightning. He screamed, hurled cups against the wall, struck servants simply because they brought water a few seconds too late. The chronicles described him with a mixture of horror and resignation. He groaned, cursed the physicians, and then, when the pain subsided, he ate and drank as though nothing had ever happened. Every few weeks, the cycle returned. He rolled on the floor like a child forced to grow up too quickly, clutching his legs as if trying to squeeze the suffering out of them. The physicians suggested bloodletting, a brutal but common practice of that era. They placed copper basins beneath him and drew out thick, dark streams of blood until his face turned pale and consciousness slipped away. The metallic scent of iron mingled with sweat, with torch smoke, and with something else, something faint yet unmistakable, as if a part of him had begun to rot from within. Then came the ointments. A mixture so foul that even looking at it stirred nausea. Horse dung, crushed garlic, and vinegar beaten into a paste. They smeared it over his legs, claiming that the fever will escape through the skin. But the only thing that escaped was the stench powerful enough that the servants stood pressed against the walls, hands covering their mouths, their eyes watering as though from grief. Summer made everything worse. Heat magnified decay. His skin split open, leaking fluid that soaked through bandages, leaving behind rags so foul that even stray dogs refused to touch them. Each morning the servants carried these scraps beyond the castle walls, holding them at arm's length, praying the wind would blow away the smell. And yet, through all this quiet ruin, the Duke continued to rule. Even while bedridden, he demanded that the executioner stand ready outside his chamber. He signed death warrants with trembling hands. He issued sentences while lying on a bed that stank of vinegar, ointment, and the slow decay of his own flesh. His moans bled into the sounds of punishment, the hammering of wood, the dragging of chains, the muted cries of the condemned. Together, these sounds formed a kind of grotesque symphony, one that Bavaria had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. The servants whispered that pain had hollowed him out, that the disease was not merely eating his body, but hollowing his mind. At night, when the walls cooled and the torches burned low, his cries echoed through the corridors, carrying a tone of something ancient, not fear, not rage, but the dawning realization that power was beginning to slip beyond the reach of his fingers. Yet even then, he refused to surrender. He clung to authority the way a drowning man clings to the last piece of wood afloat on the sea. As the days stretched into weeks, swelling consumed his legs entirely. His skin, once taut and sun-browned, sagged under the weight of disease. Red streaks appeared beneath the swelling, the sign of infection racing through him, burning from the inside out. The physicians could only watch. Their treatments offered no relief, only further torment. But he demanded more bloodletting, more ointments, more attempts to burn the illness out of him with vinegar and heated cloths. He screamed their names. He cursed them for their failures. He begged the pain to stop, then moments later demanded wine, meat, and new instruments of execution. His days swung between agony and tyranny, between helplessness and hatred, as though he were trapped between two halves of himself, the suffering man and the brutal ruler. And through it all, the stench grew. It clung to the curtains, seeped into the rushes on the floor, curled beneath the doors. Some said it settled over the courtyard like fog. Others claimed it was carried by the wind to the villages below. But all agreed on one thing. It was the scent of a body collapsing inward, of a man becoming his own tomb. This was only the beginning, the first cracks in the prison of flesh he would soon be unable to escape. The years that followed forced the physicians to write sentences they themselves could barely bring their eyes to reread. We have seen corpses rotting from the plague, but we have never seen a living man decay before our very eyes. By the decade of 1510, George II could scarcely walk. His legs had swollen all the way to his thighs. The skin stretched so tightly it seemed ready to split, and yellow fluid leaked from him without pause, soaking every cloth placed beneath him. He spent his days seated on a chair carved with a large opening beneath him, designed so he could relieve himself without needing to stand. From that throne of sickness, he received envoys, signed death orders, discussed taxes, and commanded punishments. Beneath him, the servants cleaned the waste as it fell. Above him, the physicians pierced abscess after abscess with long metal needles, forcing out pus while he clenched the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. It was a scene so grotesque that hearing it described was enough to make the strongest man swallow back bile. Then came the enemas, the most barbaric ritual in the entire Bavarian court. Heated wine, honey, crushed garlic, and pepper were poured through a bull's horn directly into his bowels. When the fumes escaped, the candles in the chamber extinguished, as though strangled by invisible hands. Some envoys covered their faces with cloaks to keep from collapsing, but the duke snarled, "Hold him here! Let him see how a king lives!" And no one dared move. As his flesh decayed, so too did his mind. What had once been a quick temper hardened into a savage paranoia. He saw betrayal in every glance, insult in every movement. A servant who stepped out of rhythm was beaten. Another had his ear cut off simply because he smiled at the wrong time. One physician, foolish or honest enough to remark that the duke's illness resembled a punishment from the devil, unintentionally condemned 12 innocent people to death burned alive as witches on the duke's command. Fear did not drip through the court anymore. It poured. People whispered that he had become a creature half human, half shadow, driven by pain and suspicion. His voice, once loud with authority, now echoed through the corridors like the cry of something chained but still dangerous. Those who served him learned to walk silently, to breathe softly, to exist like ghosts in the presence of a man who seemed to be dissolving into death while still clinging to power with rotting fingers. And the castle itself changed. It was no longer a residence, no longer a symbol of strength. It became a prison not for him alone, but for everyone trapped inside its walls. A place where even the stone seemed to absorb the sickness, holding it like damp air in winter. Monks claimed that the stench clung to their robes for days after leaving his chamber. Servants said the air tasted bitter on their tongues. Guards refused to stay inside. They stood outside the castle walls rather than within them, claiming the smell made them faint and blinded them with tears. Visitors spoke of a foul vapour that drifted from the windows like smoke from a cursed fire. Some swore that at night, the moans echoing from the upper chambers made the torches flicker as if something unseen walked past. The great halls fell into silence, except for his cries. Dust settled on long tables, once filled with feasts. Tapestries grew dull. The courtyard, once lively with horses and movement, felt like the courtyard of a forgotten monastery still, suffocating, waiting for something terrible to pass. No one called it a castle anymore. They called it a tomb. They called it a maw of the underworld. They called it the place where the Duke rotted, and where hope had died long before he would. And through those walls, through stone, through wood, through tapestries, seeped a truth no one dared speak aloud. The ruler of Bavaria was no longer a man. He was a body falling apart, a mind unravelling, a presence so foul that even the guards trembled. He was the heart of a nightmare, and the castle was his cage, a cage from which no stench, no scream, and no terror could escape. By the year 1513, the name George II no longer evoked the image of a duke. It evoked the image of a speaking corpse, a body that issued orders to burn villages, even though it could no longer stand on its own. They carried both the chair and the man together, lifting him from chamber to chamber, so he could appear before the people. A hollow ritual meant to prove that the ruler of Bavaria still lived, even as his flesh betrayed the lie with every passing hour. Rumours spread across Europe like smoke. In Prague, people joked that if the wind blew from the east, they could smell the proof that George II was still alive. In Vienna, courtiers whispered that the emperor refused to travel to Bavaria because the dead smell sweeter. These were not insults born from politics. They were the kind spoken in terror, in disbelief, in the uneasy conviction that something unnatural was happening inside that rotting fortress. The common folk were worse. Panic curled through villages like frost. Mothers warned their children, "Disobey, and I will take you to the Duke." They believed he kept demons in the castle, that the shadows of the executed wandered the courtyard aimlessly each night, searching for warmth they would never feel again. Monks refused to enter his chamber. They said the candles died too quickly inside, as if something unseen was inhaling the flames. Within that suffocating silence, George II was no longer a man. He was an invisible threat, a living curse, a shadow so heavy, so swollen and rancid, that everyone from nobles to beggars waited for the moment it would collapse under its own weight. His paranoia, his cruelty, his rage, all of it was still there, clinging to whatever remained of his consciousness. Even as people avoided his presence, even as the guards stood outside the walls instead of within them, the Duke continued to direct the world through snarled commands. He demanded the burning of homes, the flogging of servants, the execution of anyone who dared breathe wrong. His voice was the last part of him that refused to rot, though at times it cracked with pain, drifting through the corridors like a dying wind. Inside the castle, the air felt alive, as though it held the memory of every scream, every beating, every tortured plea that had echoed beneath the Duke's rule. Some claimed that footsteps could be heard in empty halls, as if the dead were pacing in anticipation. Others said that the walls themselves seemed to exhale, pushing out the smell of decay no matter how many layers of rushes were replaced. Visitors who came to Bavaria, and were brave enough or foolish enough to approach the fortress, described the same thing. A quiet that did not feel like peace, but like the moment before a storm shatters every branch in a forest. A silence that wrapped itself around the stone, the windows, the doors, until one felt swallowed by an absence so deep it became a presence. And within that presence sat George II, motionless except for the trembling of his swollen hands, silent except for the occasional groan that escaped him, sounding less like a human voice and more like the creaking of an ancient structure ready to collapse. His body pulsed with fever, his skin darkened in patches. The swelling rose and fell like tides pulled by a moon only he could see. The yellow fluid dripping from his legs stained the floors, ate into the wood, and left a sour smell that clung to every surface. People spoke less and less of him as a ruler, and more as a sign, a portent, a warning that something terrible was coming. Women drew symbols over their doors to protect their homes. Men avoided travelling near the castle at night. Children hid their faces when the Duke's name was mentioned. Bavaria itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And the inevitable was close. Those who glimpsed him in his final weeks said he looked less like a man and more like a bulging sack, ready to burst, the skin stretched thin, the abdomen swollen beyond recognition. His breathing came in shuddering waves, and sometimes his mouth moved as if whispering to someone unseen. Everyone felt it. The end. But the day his body finally burst, the moment flesh, rot, fever, and pressure broke through, the last thin barrier of skin was more horrifying than anything they had imagined. Nothing in the whispers, nothing in the rumours. nothing in the nightmares. Nothing they had feared compared to the truth of the moment George II finally exploded. George II had entered a stage where no one spoke the word Duke with reverence anymore. People whispered that there was no longer a ruler on the throne, only a corpse capable of issuing death sentences. His legs, once strong enough to crush stirrups beneath him, had become two grotesque masses of swollen flesh, cracked and leaking pus. The swelling had grown so severe that the slightest touch made him scream, as though flames were licking through his bones. He could no longer stand. He could no longer shift even an inch without agony. The servants were forced to carry both him and the chair, a chair carved with a large hole, soaked with bandages, pus, and excrement, lifting it as though they were transporting a cursed statue rather than a living man. And from that chair he continued to rule. From that chair he sentenced the mayor of Tishon to the gallows simply for complaining about taxes. From that chair he ordered the burning of villagers' barns because they dared request clean water. From that chair he shouted at envoys, forcing them to stand so close that many fainted, collapsing from the stench billowing off his rotting body. The chronicles say that when he ate, the smell rising from his flesh mingled with the heat from roasted meat until guests pressed handkerchiefs to their faces while pretending to smile. One envoy wrote, "I have witnessed war, but I have never witnessed a scent that kills the will to live so completely." His chamber became a battlefield where the enemy was the air itself. The kitchen descended into terror. A dish that was too salty, too thick, or too cool spelled doom. Cooks were beaten, tied up, or executed with no warning. One unlucky servant was drowned in a well because his soup smelled worse than its master. No one knew whether that was a sentence or a cry of despair. The entire castle existed in a half-dream, half-nightmare, suspended between exhaustion and dread. Servants stayed awake through the night, listening for his voice. They did not fear the sound of him calling, they feared silence. Because when the Duke fell silent for too long, it meant he was preparing to erupt, and when he erupted, the stone floors gained a new stain of blood. The guards lingered at the edges of rooms like ghosts, unsure where to stand, unsure how close they dared be. Musicians tried to play softly enough not to disturb him, but loudly enough not to anger him. Even the rats seemed to avoid the upper floors where the Duke lay, as though some deep instinct told them that no living creature should go near a man who was neither dead nor alive. Each breath he drew sounded like a wet, dragging whisper. His chest rose in uneven jolts, and sometimes his mouth opened as though he were trying to speak to someone only he could see. His eyes bulged, red and feverish, drifting from corner to corner as if searching for a threat that only existed inside his mind. The blankets placed over him soaked through in minutes, becoming heavy with the fluids seeping from his swollen limbs. His rage grew sharper as his body softened. Words dissolved into snarls, orders into screams. He lashed out with whatever strength remained, swinging his cane or his fists or simply his voice. Servants learned to move silently, to breathe shallowly, to become shadows. They lived in fear of a man who no longer resembled a man at all, just a mound of infected flesh, wrapped in cloth and hatred. And yet he endured. His body refused to collapse quickly. It clung to life as though determined to punish the castle, the kingdom, and himself for every cruelty he had ever committed. Day after day, it held together barely, painfully, grotesquely like a structure of rotting wood that somehow refused to fall. The people of Bavaria whispered that death had been standing beside him for months, but even death hesitated, repulsed by what it saw. His presence lingered like a curse spreading through the corridors, a suffocating weight pressing down on the servants' chests every time they entered his chamber. The Duke's body, already beginning to decay, stretched its suffering across days, then weeks, then months, as though determined to make the world endure every moment of his slow collapse. It was not mercy. It was not fate. It was punishment for the castle, for the land, and most of all, for him. The pain tormented him every day, but it was the fear inside the court that spread across the land like a silent plague. George II had become so suspicious that he trusted no one. He believed his own children wanted to kill him. He believed the servants were poisoning him. He believed the physicians conspired to replace him with a king who does not rot. Anyone who stepped into his chamber could become an enemy within a single heartbeat. One day, his eldest son entered the room without knocking. The boy merely wished to ask about his father's health, but George II screamed as if ambushed by assassins. He called for the guards, his voice cracking, and ordered them to flog the boy right in front of him. The chronicles recorded, he sat there, his face swollen and red, his hands trembling, his mouth spilling accusations even he no longer understood. Temporary deafness, headaches, and creeping blindness began to frighten him more than any rebellion ever had. His eyelids swelled until the physicians had to pry them open so he could see. There were moments when he did not recognize anyone in the room, moments when he did not even recognize his own reflection in the polished bronze mirror. When a servant approached to help him drink water, he screamed, "You have come to kill me!" and ordered the man beheaded on the spot. The servant died before he even finished bowing, while the Duke lay there, gasping, drenched in sweat. Among the common people, whispers turned darker. They said the devil had entered his body, that the rotting corpse on the throne was no longer human. Mothers warned their children, "If you lie, the Duke's demon will drag you by the legs." At night, villagers swore they heard his groans drifting down the valley, long, animalistic sounds like a creature trapped inside its own collapsing cage of bones and flesh. From Prague to Vienna, Europe whispered about him. Not about politics, not about alliances or campaigns, but about the smell. A young prince in Vienna remarked, "Bavaria could send soldiers, but our army would only need to burn incense to win." Diplomatic letters mentioned him the way travelers mention a storm as something to avoid, something that swallowed light and left only dread. Envoys who visited the castle returned home pale and shaking. They described a ruler, half blind, half mad, speaking to shadows, insisting that ghosts whispered conspiracies in the corners of his chamber. They described stepping into his room and feeling as though the air thickened around them, heavy with decay. Some claimed their clothes kept the smell for days, no matter how many times they washed them. Inside the castle, every sound carried weight. The shuffle of footsteps in the corridor became a cause for panic. The creak of a door made servants flinch. Even the wind rattling against the windows reminded them of the Duke's ragged breathing. They lived on the edge of silence, a silence so fragile that even a whispered word could shatter it into terror. The Duke's paranoia deepened with each passing week. He demanded that the guards rotate positions twice as often. He insisted that candles be lit everywhere, so he could watch the shadows, convinced that assassins hid inside them. He refused to drink anything unless he saw it poured directly from the jug. He demanded that every physician swear oaths on relics, convinced that they plotted his downfall. But no oath calmed him. No reassurance reached him. His mind was shrinking inside the walls of his rotting body, folding inward like fabric burning under flame. The court learned to walk softly, to speak carefully, to breathe quietly. They learned that a single cough could trigger a command for execution. They learned that the Duke's madness had become a living creature in the castle, a creature with ears, with claws, with a hunger for punishment. And still, the Duke was not finished suffering. His body sagged under its own weight. His swollen legs pulsed with fever. His eyelids quivered as if fighting to stay open against invisible hands. Every breath felt like an effort dragged up from some pit deep inside his chest. He lay there, trembling, terrified of the shadows he created himself. Europe waited. Bavaria waited. The entire castle waited. But George II continued to writhe inside the prison of his own flesh, a cell with no key, no escape, and no mercy. No one understood this until it was far too late. When a man slowly decays while still alive, the place he inhabits begins to decay with him. The monks wrote that the stone walls, once solid and cold, began to change colour. Not from moss, not from age, but from the smell. It clung to the very materials of the castle, sinking into each brick, each crack, as though the stench itself had weight and intention. The guards refused to stand in the corridors. They preferred the courtyard, even in snow and bitter wind, rather than spend another minute near his chamber. At night, they heard him groan, heard the bed creak beneath his swollen body, heard the soft, sickening drip of pus hitting the floor. Some begged to be reassigned. Others fled entirely, claiming that only demons breathe air like that. Neighbouring nations sent letters urging him to abdicate. One letter from Saxony warned, "Better for you to die in a monastery than for your entire duchy to suffocate in that stench." George II read the letter, then ordered the envoy to be burned alive. Not from anger, but because he believed the letter contained a curse meant to destroy him. The monks told a different story. They said that whenever they carried a crucifix into his room, the candles went out, even though every window was shut tight. They said the sores on his skin looked like mouths gasping for air, little openings through which something unseen tried to escape. A monk from Augsburg wrote, "He prays amid filth and blood, and demands that we believe in his holiness." The priests tried to mask the smell with incense, but incense only mixed with the odor, creating something stranger, something that hovered in the room like a cloud of rot that refused to lift. They left his chambers trembling, crossing themselves again and again, as though the very act of stepping inside had stained their souls. Meanwhile, the people believed the castle was no longer a home for the living. They said it had become a second corpse, and that this corpse was rotting alongside its master. Travelers avoided the road near the fortress. Farmers refused to plough fields within sight of its towers. At dusk, when the valley darkened and the sky pressed low, villagers swore they saw something move behind the windows. Not a person, not a shadow, but something in between. Mothers kept their children indoors after sunset. Men barred their doors with wooden beams. Some claimed they saw shapes wandering the ramparts, limping, dragging, dripping. Others said that at night, when the wind blew from the north, they heard a sound like a dying animal, long and low, echoing across the fields. But those who had once worked inside the castle insisted it was only the Duke breathing, a breathing that should not have belonged to a man. The castle staff dwindled. Those who remained grew pale and thin, keeping their distance even from one another, as though fear itself were contagious. They whispered that the walls had begun to sweat, that the wooden beams above the Duke's chamber sagged as if burdened by invisible rot. Some swore they saw stains spreading across the ceiling, dark and formless, like bruises on a giant body. Letters arrived from Prague saying the stench had become a political matter, a sign of divine punishment. Vienna murmured that no ambassador should risk the journey. One wrote secretly, "If death had a smell, Bavaria has become its home." Diplomats refused to enter the Duke's chamber, claiming their lungs burned after only a few minutes inside. But the Duke remained, breathing, decaying, commanding. He asked for no mercy, and gave none. He believed every whisper from neighboring lands was an attack, every suggestion of abdication a conspiracy. He clutched his authority the way a drowning man clutches driftwood, with fingers shaking, desperate, terrified. And still, the castle rotted with him. The tapestries clung limply to the walls, heavy with absorbed fumes. The rushes on the floor blackened. The hallways grew darker, as if the torches could not shine through the air anymore. Servants fainted when forced to pass his door. Some woke with burning throats, swearing they had inhaled corruption itself. The people outside believed the Duke had already died, and what ruled them now was only his spirit, a malignant echo trapped inside a collapsing body. They whispered that the castle was a shell, an empty husk filled with sickness, and that soon, very soon, the land would be free of both the man and the monster the castle had become. No one slept inside the castle anymore. Each night, his groans rose through the halls like the sound of a cow having its throat cut. Long, dragging, desperate, and then suddenly silent. That silence frightened the servants more than the cries themselves. Every time the noise stopped, they thought, "He is dead." But then the wet, ragged wheezing began again, stretching out like wind scraping through a deep cavern. His chamber became forbidden ground. Servants entered only when their names were called, and no one ever knew when or if they would be allowed to leave. Some went in at dusk and were executed before dawn. Their bodies were not washed, not mourned, not even touched. They were dragged out by ropes tied to their limbs, because no one could bear the stench long enough to lift them. The physicians no longer knew what to do. They tried everything the medieval world could imagine: bloodletting, dung ointments, burning herbs, cooling the abdomen with stones, wine enemas. Each procedure sent him into howling fits, screams that seemed to tear from the deepest part of him. The smell that rose from his body during these treatments was so overpowering that the candles in the room extinguished themselves, as though the air had lost all oxygen. One night, he demanded that a servant be hanged because the man had dropped a cloth. They obeyed. The servant was strung up just outside the Duke's window, where his choking breaths could be heard clearly inside the chamber. The chronicles wrote, "He ate chicken while listening to the man die." The image seared itself into the memory of every servant who survived that night. In the villages, people said each scream from the Duke was a soul being dragged into hell. They burned incense, dried herbs, and hay to ward off the curse they believed was spilling down from the castle. They hung charms above their doors. But nothing stopped the smell. It drifted into the valley, curling around homes, seeping into clothes. settling in the hair of children who slept too close to open windows. Even the animals grew restless, braying and pacing long after midnight. And then, slowly, the Duke's belly, the swollen mound that had grown for so many years, became something no one dared look at directly. It stretched further each day, rounding outward like a swollen wineskin left too long in the sun. The skin shone tight and glossy, as though pulled to its absolute limit. Dark veins climbed across it like rivers on a map, pulsing beneath the surface. Physicians approached with caution, afraid even the pressure of their gaze might cause it to rupture. The Duke himself seemed to sense the change. He clutched his abdomen with trembling hands, hissing whenever it shifted beneath his touch. He begged for cold cloths, for wine, for prayers, for silence, but nothing eased the tension building inside him. His breaths came shorter. Sweat rolled down his temples. His eyes bulged with a terror not even he could hide. The servants whispered that they could hear something inside him faint at first, like water sloshing in a barrel, then louder, more insistent, a churning, a bubbling, a sound of something trapped and furious, trying to break free. They swore they saw the belly move, rising and falling in uneven patterns that did not match his breathing. Outside the chamber, guards crossed themselves. Even the bravest among them refused to stand too close to the door. The monks who prayed in the corridors did so with trembling voices, unable to keep their words steady. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. The body of George II had reached a point beyond the natural world, beyond illness, beyond suffering. It had entered the realm of the inevitable. The castle waited. Bavaria waited. Europe whispered. And within the suffocating darkness of his chamber, the Duke's swollen abdomen stretched to a point where the skin no longer creaked. It strained in silence, like the moment before a storm splits the sky. No one dared touch him. No one dared breathe. Everyone knew the truth. The bursting was near. By this point, George II's belly was no longer a belly. It was a drum stretched to breaking. A swollen skin sac filled with toxic gas, pus, and what the physicians whispered as the vapor of the dead. His skin gleamed like hot wax, stretched so tightly that even the slightest touch might have torn it open. The servants replaced the straw under his bed 3 or 4 times a day, yet the fluid seeped out so quickly that the straw began to stink before it even absorbed anything. Some days, his abdomen swelled so violently that the ties of his tunic snapped apart on their own. Panic overtook him. He ordered the servants to strap his body to a wide wooden plank, convinced that if he did not bind himself, he would explode without warning. The monks gathered around him with crosses in their trembling hands, while the servants kept their distance, reduced to vague silhouettes in the flicker of the torches they held far, far away. The physicians attempted what they called releasing the vapors. They drove a long needle into his abdomen. A sharp hiss escaped a sound so unnatural that even the monks recoiled. Then the smell erupted. It was so overwhelming that one servant collapsed instantly, his body folding like wet cloth before he hit the floor. George II screamed, slamming his fists against the wooden frame, cursing 7 generations of anyone who dared flee. An envoy from Burgundy later wrote, "I have seen war. I have seen men beheaded. But never have I known a horror like watching the Duke's belly breathe. Thank you for watching." Even breathing had become an act of defiance against nature. The flesh rose and fell in movements that no longer matched the rhythm of his lungs. It pulsed as if something inside were pushing outward, something eager to break free, something with a will of its own. The physicians tried cold towels. They tried heated oils. They tried prayers, relics, and chants. Nothing slowed the swelling. Nothing eased the pressure. The skin stretched thinner each hour, glowing red in places, yellow in others, shining like a lantern made of human flesh. The sound inside him changed too, first a sloshing, then a bubbling, and finally a low, continuous rumble, like thunder trapped under skin. The castle was silent, except for him. Everyone felt it. The moment approaching. Servants walked barefoot so their steps would not echo. Guards whispered even outdoors. Monks prayed with their hands shaking so hard the crosses clattered together. Even the rats avoided his chamber, scurrying along the far edges of the hall as though guided by some primal instinct. And George II, once a terror to his people, once a man whose voice could condemn an entire village, lay strapped to a plank, unable to move, barely able to breathe, trembling under the weight of his own decaying flesh. His body was more corpse than man, held together only by pain and pride. His eyes bulged, wild with fear, darting from monk to servant to doctor. He demanded ice, then fire, then silence, then music, then death, then mercy, then everything at once. No one obeyed. No one dared get close. The monks wrote that they could not approach his bedside without feeling heat radiating from his abdomen, an unnatural heat, like standing beside a forge filled with rotten meat. The air shimmered above him. Drops of fluid oozed slowly from the stretched skin, forming dark rivulets that slid down his sides and pooled beneath him. His breathing quickened. The skin tightened further. The monks stepped back. The torches flickered. Something in the room seemed to hold its breath. His body, a rotting shell kept alive by agony, was preparing for its final act, the moment even the monks would not describe, without covering their faces and gagging. Because when that belly burst, the entire castle would learn what the smell of living death truly was. It was a day so hot the air felt thick enough to chew, each breath like swallowing smoke. The monks later wrote that on that day they could not recite their prayers, not because they forgot the words, but because the sound of George II's groaning smothered every syllable. It did not resemble a human voice. It was the sound of a beam cracking before a house collapses, or of a great animal being carved alive. The chamber was nearly pitch black, despite the rows of candles. Each flame flared, shuddered, then died, as if an unseen hand pinched it out. The servants stood outside the door, frozen between terror and duty. To enter might mean death, but to flee the castle meant a worse fate, being hunted down and executed. In this place, running was a confession of guilt. The physicians decided to attempt one more enema, a ritual they themselves trembled to perform. As soon as they brushed the edge of his swollen abdomen, George II screamed, his eyes bulging so far it seemed they might burst. His breathing came in harsh, mechanical bursts, like bellows forcing air through broken iron. Even with cloths soaked in herbs pressed to their faces, the servants retched uncontrollably, doubling over again and again. Then it happened, an accident so small and so ordinary it could have occurred any day. One physician reached beneath him to reposition the vessel. He needed only to rotate the duke a little, just enough for the wooden board beneath to scrape against the stone floor. Just a shift, just a slight turn. A single sound followed, a crack, delicate, almost gentle, like the shell of an egg giving way beneath a fingertip. Then came the second sound, a burst, deep and wet, the unmistakable shatter of something swollen far beyond its limits. It reverberated through the chamber with the weight of a collapsing rotten barrel. His abdomen had ruptured. The chronicles recorded, the sound echoed to the gates of the fortress. The stench rose like a fire made entirely of corpses. The first to flee were the servants. They did not look back. The monks spilled into the courtyard, choking, gagging, praying loudly, and vomiting between every plea. Guards on the upper floors abandoned their posts, dropping spears, helmets, anything in their hands, and sprinting downhill as though chased by an army of ghosts. Inside the room, what poured out of him was not merely fluid. It was decay itself, years of trapped rot exploding at once. Thick clouds of steam and foul vapor rolled out as if the inside of him had been fermenting under unbearable heat. Pus, blood, gas, and blackened matter splashed across the stone floor, spattering the boots and robes of anyone too stunned to move. But the horror was not finished, because George II did not die immediately. He lived. He lived while the insides of his body spilled out. He lived long enough to understand what had happened, and he began to scream. The scream was unlike any he had uttered before, high, ripping, almost childish in its terror. His hands clawed at the air. He tried to rise, but nothing obeyed him. The weight of his own failing body pinned him down like a corpse that refused to stop crushing its owner. The monks outside heard the scream and fell to their knees, covering their ears. One wrote later, "It was the cry of a soul being torn from a living carcass." The few physicians still in the room staggered back, slipping in the fluid spreading across the floor. One tripped and slid, his hands hitting something warm, sticky, and unspeakable. George II dragged in a breath, a wet, bubbling sound, and screamed again. His voice cracked, his vision blurred, his mouth filled with the taste of blood and bile. He thrashed, not from strength, but from sheer, blind panic. His body had become a prison that shattered around him, piece by agonizing piece. The rupture continued to widen. Gas hissed from the torn flesh. Liquids leaked in streams. The smell only grew worse, so dense it seemed to have texture, as if the air had turned into spoiled meat. The guards who had run down the hill swore the scream followed them across the valley. Villagers miles away claimed they heard it echo between the mountains, carried on a wind that tasted of salt and rot. Inside the castle, the last people remaining near the chamber, a single monk and 2 physicians, could do nothing but watch as the Duke writhed on his plank, his eyes full of terror, his voice cracking into hoarse, broken sobs. They did not touch him. They did not pray over him. They could barely stand to breathe the same air. And still, somehow, unbelievably, the Duke clung to life long enough to feel every second of the catastrophe that his own body had become. The scene after the rupture no longer resembled anything human. George II's body had split like a rotted gourd, spilling its contents in thick streams. Fluids yellow, red, black slid down the edge of the bed, dripping into widening stains on the stone floor. The monks fell to their knees, not in prayer, but because their legs buckled beneath them. Terror, not reverence, had brought them down. George II began raving. He screamed the names of women he had executed years before, calling them as if they stood just outside the door. He shouted commands to burn half the realm, to salt the fields, to hang every servant who dared breathe the same air. He accused his children of treason, cursing them one by one, as though he could see them plotting in the shadows. He demanded wine, demanded meat, demanded the executioner, though not a single soul dared step into the chamber. A monk later wrote, "His cries were like the sound of a door opening in hell." The physicians stood in the doorway, trembling violently, pressed back against the stone arch as if the air itself might swallow them whole. They understood that approaching him meant risking suffocation, or worse, a death sentence issued by a delirious ruler whose mind had dissolved into madness. And then the decay began visibly, shockingly fast. Before their eyes, his skin shifted colours, a sickly green, then a bruised violet, then a deepening black, like fruit left too long in the sun. The tears in his flesh continued to ooze a thick, tar-like substance that none of them dared name. The air grew heavier, denser. One physician clutched his chest and stumbled away, convinced that breathing it would end his life. George II's screams weakened, not because the pain had lessened, but because his voice had torn itself apart. Each exhalation was a ragged whisper, and each whisper seemed to scrape against the last of his strength. Finally, in a sound that was barely a sound at all, he exhaled one final breath. The guards outside described it as wind passing through the crack of a grave, thin and cold, as though the castle itself sighed in relief. But the horror did not end. His corpse, if it could still be called a corpse, continued to swell. The gases trapped inside, the decay that had been festering for years, pushed outward, bloating him beyond human shape. His abdomen puffed upward, then outward, as if the body intended to burst a second time. And the smell did not merely spread. It erupted. The stench surged out of the chamber like a poisonous fog, rolling down the corridor, seeping through the cracks in the stone. Guards who had made it 20 paces from the door doubled over, vomiting into their helmets. 2 monks fainted, collapsing onto the courtyard steps. One scribe wrote that he tried to breathe through his sleeve, then through 2 sleeves, then gave up entirely and fled the castle barefoot. The odour was not merely foul. It was unnatural, thick, oily, and heavy, like the reek of a slaughterhouse left in the sun for weeks. Within minutes, the castle turned into chaos. Doors slammed. Footsteps thundered through the hallways. Servants scrambled toward open air. Horses bolted from their stalls, snorting wildly as if they sensed a predator. One monk described it as a storm without wind, a wave of corruption that swept through every room, clinging to floors, tapestries, hair, and skin. No corner of the keep was spared. Even the high tower, where a lone guard kept watch, filled with the invisible smoke of rot. And through the corridor leading to George II's chamber, the fumes hung heaviest, so thick they blurred the torches, turning flames into dim orange smudges. His body had not merely died. It had become a source of poison, and word would soon spread, faster than the smell that the Duke who once ruled with fire and terror had left behind something far more terrifying than his cruelty. A corpse that refused to stop rotting. Over a single night, the corpse swelled so grotesquely that the coffin lid would not close. They tried ropes, thick ropes, tied tightly, but the knots kept slipping loose because his skin leaked a slick, oily fluid that coated everything it touched. The funeral, instead of a ritual of mourning, became an ordeal. Servants carried the coffin with trembling hands, eyes watering, their steps faltering every few meters as they turned aside to vomit against the stone walls. The chronicles record that the stench was so powerful that even the passing wind seemed to change color. When the coffin was carried out of the castle gates, the villagers scattered in terror. Dogs howled and pulled against their chains. Horses reared violently, eyes rolling white. Children shrieked without understanding why, their instincts sensing what their minds could not. The monks tried to chant, voices quivering, but they were forced to open every window, cover their noses with sleeves, and cling to their candles, which guttered repeatedly in the thick, foul air pushed ahead of the corpse. Meanwhile, in neighboring realms, the news spread like wildfire, and with it, laughter. Prague remarked, "The northern wind is gentler today, perhaps the Duke has finally died." Vienna hosted a celebratory feast. A French count wrote home, "Europe breathes easier now that Bavaria's stench no longer reaches our borders." But in Bavaria, the funeral became a storm of shame. The people did not weep, they laughed. A woman, one he had abused for years, stepped forward, hurled a torn, filthy cloth onto the road, and screamed, "This is what he lived on." The crowd erupted. Shouts, cheers, the pounding of feet on dirt. A group of women began dancing directly in front of the coffin, spinning, stamping, raising dust into the air as if performing an exorcism. The monks rushed toward them, trying to push them back, but the women screamed, "We will dance until his name rots from this earth." It was the only funeral in Bavarian memory where laughter drowned out prayer, where joy drowned out fear, where relief smothered ritual. The procession moved slowly, not out of reverence, but because the pallbearers kept choking, stepping backward, wiping their faces, and struggling to force themselves close enough to continue. Behind them, the crowd swelled. People spat on the ground where the coffin passed. Some threw black bread, the cheapest, bitterest bread, onto the road as a final insult. Others whispered curses meant to bind his spirit far below the soil. Even elderly men, who normally bowed during any funeral, kept their backs straight and their eyes cold. The coffin itself creaked, strained by the swollen corpse inside. Ropes snapped twice. At one point, the lid lifted a few inches as gases forced upward, releasing a hiss so foul that the entire front row staggered back in horror. A monk dropped his rosary. A young scribe fainted, collapsing onto the stones. And still, the laughter rolled on. Children imitated the Duke's heavy breathing, turning it into a game. Farmhands joked that the crops would grow better now that the great rot had finally been buried. An old shepherd crossed himself and muttered, "Let the earth hold him tight, for if he rises, Bavaria will choke again." As the procession neared the burial site, even the priest's voice broke. He tried to utter the final rites, but each inhale burned his throat. The words came out thin, twisted by the air that clung to him like smoke from a pyre. The coffin was lowered quickly, too quickly, nearly slipping from the ropes. Soil was thrown over it in frantic shovelfuls, not as blessing, but as defense. The moment the last clump of earth fell, people stepped back, not in solemnity, but in recoil. They wanted the ground to swallow him whole, immediately, permanently, and as they dispersed, leaving the grave behind, one final truth settled over the valley. It was the only funeral in Bavaria's history where the silence afterward felt cleaner than the prayers spoken during it. After the burial, one might have expected the story to end, but it did not. Legends sprouted like fungi across the very soil he had once ruled with blood and terror. Villagers swore they heard footsteps in the abandoned corridors of the castle. Candles went out on their own, even when the air was still. The water in the wells near the stronghold turned a deep, rusty red, as though rinsed in old blood. One soldier claimed he saw a swollen silhouette sitting atop the tower, raising an arm in a slow, beckoning motion, as if inviting someone to come closer. The monks whispered that dark stains shaped like human faces began appearing on the chapel walls. They scraped the stone clean, painted over it with fresh lime, but by the next morning the stains had returned clearer, darker, almost breathing. People believed they were the trapped souls of those George II had executed, unable to move on, bound forever to the place where terror had ended their lives. But the most haunting tale was about the women who had danced at his funeral. One by one, within a single year, each of them died suddenly. The chroniclers wrote, they were found with faces twisted by terror. The villagers whispered, "George has come back for revenge." And then came a prophecy whispered from farm to market, from monastery to tavern, that one day the castle would collapse under its own curse, and from beneath the rubble, his swollen, dripping spectre would rise, grinning crookedly, the skin split, the eyes bulging to drag the living down with him. People began avoiding the path near the stronghold. Farmers took the long road around the valley. Children were warned never to play near the hill. Even the castle guards, who once strutted proudly around its walls, refused to approach after sunset. They said the wind changed there thicker, slower, smelling faintly of rot as though the grave itself were breathing. At night, travellers reported seeing faint lights flicker in the broken windows, like lanterns moving through the dark corridors. Others claimed they heard soft tapping, as though knuckles rapped gently on the inside of stone walls. A shepherd passing by at dawn saw a shadow perched on the battlement. It did not move like a human. It pulsed, swelling, shrinking, swelling again like a body full of trapped air. Stories spread faster than reason. Some said his spirit wandered the ramparts, dragging chains slick with decay. Others said he crawled across the courtyard on hands and knees, leaving a wet trail behind. A widow insisted she heard him whisper her name from the well. And still, no one dared deny the tales. Not because they believed every detail, but because everyone understood one thing. In Bavaria, the memory of George II did not simply linger. It contaminated. Silence settled over the region like a shroud. The villagers boarded up their windows. Monks performed midnight rites they had not practiced in generations. Women carried charms of iron and salt. Men spat over their shoulders when passing the castle road. Even the animals seemed uneasy. Cows refused to graze near the slope. Horses balked without explanation. Dogs whined with their tails tucked low. The castle, once a symbol of authority, had become something else entirely. A carcass of stone. A tomb with its lid cracked open. A place where the dead did not rest, and the living did not dare breathe too deeply. And every night, when the wind changed direction, when the torchlight flickered for no reason, when the valley fell unnaturally quiet, the people whispered the same sentence: "He is not finished with us." And that is the story, not a tale told to frighten children, not a legend embroidered by frightened peasants, but recorded history. A history of a man who began life wrapped in absolute power, only to end it with a body collapsing in on itself, intestines bursting, skin rotting, and a name cursed long after his final breath. George II lived in stench and died in stench, leaving behind a castle that required weeks to scrape clean. The walls were scrubbed with lime until the stone bled white. The straw bedding was burned daily. Entire sections of flooring were torn out and replaced. Even then, the odour lingered, clinging to corners like a memory that refused to fade. The rats never returned. The servants fled. Villagers shook their heads whenever his name was spoken. And across Europe, monarchs and nobles quietly exhaled, as if the air itself had grown lighter now that Bavaria's source of rot had finally stopped breathing. But the monks wrote one final sentence in the chronicle, one that made later readers pause, raise their eyes from the page, and feel a slow coldness crawl up the spine. He died as he lived, surrounded by stench, and imprisoned within the curse of his own soul. And that is why even now, generations later, people still whisper, there are stories that should not be read aloud at night. Not because they are untrue, but because they are too true, and the scent of that truth sometimes still drifts in the air of Bavaria,